The first shells fell before sunrise. A dull, rolling concussion spread across the western edge of the Ardennes. Frost lifted from the ground in trembling sheets. Snow shook off the pine branches in light bursts. The men of the 3rd Armored Division lifted their heads at the same moment, as if struck by the same silent instinct. It was December 1944. The German counteroffensive had begun. American lines bent in the cold wind of the Battle of the Bulge. On the eastern slope near the village of Rocherath, a wrecked M4 Sherman lay half buried in churned snow and frozen mud. Its turret was jammed at an awkward angle. Its transmission had died 3 days earlier. It had been stripped of tools, fuel, rations, anything useful, before the crew retreated under artillery fire. Now, the tank sat empty, silent, forgotten, except by 3 men. At 0730, Staff Sergeant Walter Briggs trudged toward the wreck with a wrench dangling from his hand like a tired extension of his arm. Behind him came Corporal Sam Foley and Private Henry Vargas. None of them were tankers. They were mechanics men who lived in grease and metal shavings more than in foxholes, but the front had moved too fast, and now the front had come to them. Briggs reached the ruined Sherman. He placed a boot on the glacis and exhaled. Steam drifted from his mouth, rising past the jagged hole in the turret where a German 75mm round had punched through days earlier. "Looks dead," Foley said. Briggs nodded. "That's the point." A jeep pulled up. A communications officer stepped out, handed Briggs a folded map, and left without a word. Orders didn't require conversation. Briggs unfolded the map. A red X marked the position of the destroyed tank. Above it, a handwritten note. "Make it look alive." He stared at the words for a long moment. Then he folded the map again, tucked it into his coat, and looked at the Sherman as though seeing it for the first time. The sky hummed in the distance. A low vibration. Not thunder. Not artillery. Aircraft. German reconnaissance planes, Luftwaffe H's 126 seconds and Bf 109 seconds, were expected to sweep the sector by midday. American command needed enemy pilots to misread what they saw from the sky. They needed to suggest strength, to imply armor where armor no longer existed. And in that narrow window of cold and smoke and uncertainty, Briggs and his 2-man crew had been given a simple directive with enormous consequences. Turn this wreck into a tank no pilot would ignore. They began immediately. Briggs climbed onto the hull. The metal burned cold even through his gloves. He knocked on the side. A hollow echo answered. The tank was empty, light, brittle, nothing like the 30-ton presence it once held. But deception did not require strength. Only shape. Only silhouette. Only suggestion. The 3 mechanics worked quietly. There was no time for discussion. No time for doubts. They patched the turret hole with a sheet of scrap metal scavenged from a blown half-track. Foley hammered it flat with short, rhythmic strikes. Vargas filled the seams with frozen mud, smoothing it with the side of his glove. From a distance, the shape looked whole again. Next, they rigged the main gun. It had been bent slightly downward by the blast that killed the tank. Briggs wedged a length of pine trunk beneath the barrel, elevating it back to a believable angle. He wrapped the base in camouflage netting to hide the crude support. Then came paint. A German artillery crate had yielded 2 cans of surplus field gray. Mixed with melted snow and soot scraped from burnt vehicles, it produced a grim, mottled tone that blended with the winter landscape. The tank began to resemble itself again, less a corpse, more a threat. But Briggs knew that shapes could fool infantry. Aircraft were harder. Luftwaffe reconnaissance pilots were trained to read shadows. Angles. The way sunlight struck metal surfaces. The way exhaust stains marked an engine deck. The way tank treads left scars across the snow. A dead tank carried no heat. No oil streaks. No exhaust. No tracks. So they created everything the tank no longer produced. Vargas dragged a chain behind a jeep, carving fresh tread marks around the tank. Foley splashed motor oil salvaged from destroyed vehicles onto the engine deck, letting it drip naturally down the armor plates. Briggs lit a small fire of straw and grease-soaked rags near the tank's rear, letting the smoke curl up beneath the overhang to simulate engine vapor. By 1100, the illusion was complete. The Sherman looked operational, looked maintained, looked ready. Briggs stood back. He studied the angles. He scanned the sky. He listened. The distant hum grew louder, then closer, then unmistakable. The mechanics dove into a foxhole as a German reconnaissance plane swept over the tree line, moving slow and deliberate, the way a hawk glides above static prey. The plane banked once, then again. Its shadow slid across the snow, across the foxhole, across the decoy tank. Briggs held his breath. He felt the cold against his teeth. He counted the seconds between engine pulses. The plane circled a final time, then climbed, then vanished. Briggs exhaled. He didn't smile. He didn't speak. He only resumed breathing. That afternoon, American artillery batteries reported receiving German fire based on aerial coordinates. The rounds landed more than 200 yards away, precisely where Briggs's decoy sat. The Luftwaffe had been fooled. The dead tank had drawn fire meant for the living. In the hours that followed, the three mechanics worked on additional deception. They placed logs where armor should be, canvas where turrets should be, shadow where steel could not be spared. They became, for a brief period, architects of illusion. The task went beyond technique. It went beyond engineering. It entered a realm where war blurred into theater, where survival depended not only on weapons, but on imagination. World War II armies used decoys constantly. The British built inflatable Shermans for Operation Fortitude. The Germans shaped wooden Spitfires to bait Allied bombers. The Allies mirrored entire divisions with fake radio traffic and dummy artillery. But what Briggs and his men accomplished was different. They worked under fire, on a deadline measured not in hours but in enemy flight schedules. Their raw materials were scraps, mud, smoke, and instinct. The tactical value of deception was simple: misallocation. Every German round fired at a phantom tank was one less aimed at a real one. Every bomb dropped on a decoy was a mission wasted. Every pilot misled disrupted the enemy's assessment of American strength. Military analysts later calculated the cost of Briggs's deception: less than $4 worth of scrap and paint. The cost in enemy effort: several $1,000s in artillery barrages and flight operations. Efficiency measured in a brutal ratio. But the psychological weight was greater. For the mechanics, the moment the plane circled overhead stretched unnaturally long. Stress narrowed vision. Cold tightened muscles. The brain toggled between clarity and static. Fear did not manifest in tremors or shouts, but in stillness compressed into slow, measured breaths. Their thoughts were not heroic, not philosophical. They thought about shrapnel. They thought about the angle of descent of a diving aircraft. They thought about how mud smelled when mixed with burning oil. Someone once asked Briggs, years after the war, why he did it. He answered, without hesitation, "Because the tank couldn't help us anymore, so we made it help." That was the essence of American wartime improvisation. Not perfection. Not doctrine. Improvisation. Factories produced thousands of tanks, trucks, guns, planes. But at the front, the decisive tools were often wrenches, rope, canvas, scrap metal, and a willingness to reshape the battlefield with whatever remained. The industrial might of the United States created abundance. The ingenuity of individual soldiers turned abundance and even wreckage into strategy. It reflected a larger principle. War is not only a contest of firepower. It is a contest of perception, a contest of attention, a contest of limited information shaping unlimited consequences. Commanders must predict what the enemy sees. Mechanics must predict what the enemy assumes. Pilots, staring down at a shivering winter battlefield from 5,000 feet, must interpret shadows as truth. And sometimes shadows lie. When the Bulge eventually collapsed and American forces pushed east, Briggs passed the wrecked decoy again. The snow had melted around it. The pine trunk still held the barrel aloft. The oil stains had frozen into black veins across the hull. Shrapnel scars pocked the ground nearby. German shells had landed exactly where they were meant to land. Briggs placed his hand on the metal one last time. It felt warmer now, touched by sun rather than fire. Then he walked away. History rarely records the names of mechanics. It lists divisions, operations, campaigns. It remembers generals and medals and movements of armies. But war is built on the hands that turn bolts, pull chains, reshape wreckage, and make dead machines speak again. The decoy tank stood for months after the front moved. Eventually, the weather reclaimed it. Rust broke through the paint. The patched metal peeled away. The pine support collapsed. Snow buried the tracks one last time. But the idea remained. Simple, quiet, effective, a wreck given purpose, a corpse made useful, a machine that fought after it died. War teaches strange lessons. It teaches that value can be created, not just destroyed. It teaches that ingenuity is a weapon. It teaches that the difference between threat and illusion is sometimes just the distance from a cockpit window to the ground. Briggs never sought recognition. He returned home. He worked in a machine shop. He rarely spoke about the war. But when he did, he repeated the same phrase he wrote in his notebook in 1944. Metal remembers what men make it do. A cold sentence. A precise sentence. A sentence that captures both the brutality and the creativity of war. In the end, the decoy tank did not change the course of the Battle of the Bulge. But it saved lives. It misled an enemy. It demonstrated the power of the ordinary, made extraordinary by necessity. And it stands as a reminder of an uncelebrated truth. Even in the largest war the world has ever seen, sometimes victory turns on a handful of mechanics, a wrecked tank, and an idea forged in the cold. The front advanced. The tank decayed. The story stayed. Because deception, in war, leaves a mark as real as steel.